You know, Gary Hume is part of a group of really important British artists who emerged in the late 80s, early 90s. And they're important because they made a really big break with a lot of things that had gone before, and it was really a very, very dynamic moment in the London art scene. And if you think about Gary in relation to that group, Gary was without doubt the most important painter within that context. And as a painter, he both connected to a certain history of British painting, and on the other hand, produced something that was so completely new that no one had really done before. And so his role is very influential, not just in terms of artists younger than himself, but I would also argue that his contemporaries, even when they were students, were looking at Gary as a particular model of what a new painting could be and what it could look like. So something happened, and I think things happen for a variety of reasons, and it's very often when several reasons come together that you get a synthesis that produces something unique. And I think that a combination of things like a depressed economy, like a particular context where there was a group of artists who were working in a very open way. Now, what kind of way is that? At Goldsmith's, at the time, it was pretty much the only art school where you could arrive at school not as a painter, not as a sculptor, not something specific like that, but you came as an artist. And while you were there, you developed your practice. You could become one thing or another, but there was an openness of medium and practice that was really surprising, because normally art schools in the UK have a very long-standing tradition of working within the medium for which they're famous. And Goldsmith's was different, and it produced a kind of work that was very experimental and very fresh. But I also think it wasn't just that there were one or two great artists. There were a lot, and there was a really very viable, recognizable group of artists of whom Gary is one of the most celebrated. And that produced a very exciting environment in the UK. So exciting, I would argue, that, you know, normally when we look at art history, we sort of say, well, the museum made the artist. In the UK, we can say the opposite, that the artist made the museum. That is to say that we did not really have a contemporary art scene that was really powerful and dynamic until that moment. And there were so many exciting artists that were coming out of London at that time that it produced a lot of galleries. And in the end, we could even argue that it produced something like Tate Modern, the first proper modern art museum in the UK, because there were so many of these amazing artists and so on. I have another theory about Goldsmiths. I'm very biased because I love Goldsmiths and I've taught there for a long time, but I have another theory about Goldsmiths, which is that Goldsmiths sits in you know, one of the poorer parts of London. And it was, and of course artists go to those areas because that's where they can afford to live. And all the other art schools, the great art schools in London, all were sitting in the center of the city. So imagine, you're going and do your classes, and at 5 o'clock you finish, and then at 5 o'clock you go home. But one guy goes north, one guy goes south, one guy goes east. In Goldsmiths, at 5 o'clock you go to the pub, and everybody still stays talking. And what you see in Goldsmiths as a legacy is a community. And so that is a really interesting part of this process, that actually is a real community that grew out of Goldsmiths. That yBa movement, as it came to be known, isn't exclusively Goldsmiths, but I would say it's 90% the case. Because where it becomes great, what makes something great is when artists talk to each other. And that's what happened, and that's the incredible moment. And it's fascinating because very often it doesn't happen when the economy is good, when people are happy and whatever. It happens in the opposite. It happens in a time of crisis. It happens when there are no opportunities. And this generation was special, and it's the first time in British history. These guys took it on themselves. They made their own shows. They put up walls to make it look like a beautiful minimal museum. They created environments that looked professional in a way that no other young generation had ever done that. And they organized their own presence. Instead of waiting to go through the cycle of 10 years until you got an exhibition or whatever, they just did it. They were still students. They organized something, and they made it happen for themselves. So it was very self-driven, and in that sense, very exciting.